The Lady of the Dunes. On a summer morning in 1974, a 12-year-old girl walking her dog through the dunes of Provincetown, Massachusetts, stumbled onto something she would never forget. Lying face down on a beach blanket was the body of a woman. Her hands were missing. Her skull had been crushed. Her head was nearly severed. Beneath her head were a pair of folded Wrangler jeans and a blue bandana, placed there, almost deliberately. For decades, investigators tried to identify her. She became known only as the Lady of the Dunes. Police scoured missing person reports, dentists compared dental records, and clay models of her face were created in 1979, updated in 2000, and again in 2010. But none of it worked. 3 times, in 1980, 2000, and 2013, her remains were exhumed to collect more forensic evidence. Each attempt ended in frustration, and so, theories began to multiply. Some speculated she was tied to Boston mobster Whitey Bulger. Others pointed to convicted killer Haddon Clark, who once claimed involvement. In 2015, author Joe Hill, son of Stephen King, suggested the Lady of the Dunes might even appear briefly as an extra in the 1975 movie Jaws. But every lead collapsed into nothing. Then came a breakthrough. In 2022, nearly half a century later, the FBI and forensic genealogy company Othram used investigative genetic genealogy to identify the woman as Ruth Marie Terry, a 37-year-old from Tennessee. DNA extracted from her remains was compared to online genealogy databases and eventually matched to her family. After 48 years, she finally regained her name. But another question remained. Who killed her? Investigators discovered Ruth had secretly married Guy Rockwell Moldovan, a 37-year-old antiques dealer, just months before her death. That same year, she traveled with him to visit family, then vanished. Moldovan returned alone, driving her car, and told people she had simply left him. Moldovan already had a disturbing past. In 1960, he was a suspect in the disappearance of his previous wife, Joan Patricia Mack, and her daughter Patricia Moran in Seattle. Though never charged with murder, he was later convicted of fraud and sent to prison. A pattern of deception was already there. Finally, in August 2023, Massachusetts authorities announced their conclusion. Guy Rockwell Moldovan murdered Ruth Marie Terry in July 1974. Because Moldovan himself had died in 2002, the case was officially closed. For nearly 50 years, the Lady of the Dunes was a nameless mystery. Thanks to advances in DNA technology, her identity was restored. And with it, investigators believe they have finally solved the crime that haunted Cape Cod for half a century.
Once you identify her and you can start putting her life back together, and once they started doing that, that led right to her husband.
The collar bomb incident. On August 28, 2003, a man walks into a bank with a homemade shotgun disguised as a cane. Around his neck, a locked metal collar. Attached to it is a live bomb. Minutes later, that bomb exploded on live TV. This is the story of the pizza bomber. A 46-year-old pizza delivery driver, Brian Wells, entered a PNC bank in Erie, Pennsylvania. He handed the teller a note demanding $250,000. But Wells insisted he wasn't a robber and said someone had forced him into robbing the bank under threat of detonation. But here's the twist. He didn't leave with $250,000. He walked out with less than $9,000, and police caught him almost immediately in a nearby parking lot. Surrounded, Wells begged officers to believe the bomb was real and that he was just a victim. As they waited for the bomb squad, time slipped away. And then, on live television, the device detonated. Wells was killed instantly. The FBI launched a comprehensive investigation into the intricate plot. The bizarre nature of the case left investigators unsure whether Wells was an unwilling participant or a co-conspirator. The bomb wasn't crude. It was expertly built, with multiple locks, decoy wires, and booby traps. Even stranger, Wells carried pages of notes with detailed instructions, a scavenger hunt of tasks supposedly meant to delay detonation. The notes mapped out a twisted series of stops across Erie, retrieving keys, solving steps, and racing against the clock. However, investigators later concluded that the scavenger hunt was impossible to complete within the given time frame. It was never meant to save Wells, only to control him, stall law enforcement, and add another layer of deception to an already bizarre crime. And the deeper the agents dug, the stranger it got. investigators uncovered a conspiracy. Locals in Erie, Marjorie Deal Armstrong, Kenneth Barnes, William Bill Rothstein, and Floyd Stockton had plotted the robbery to fund other crimes, including murder for hire. Deal Armstrong was the mastermind. Rothstein likely built the device. Barnes helped plan, and Stockton assisted. But what about Brian Wells? Pawn or player? Was he a willing accomplice who thought the bomb was fake, or an innocent victim forced into the scheme? Prosecutors decided it was both. He'd been recruited, but once the collar snapped shut, he became a hostage to his own fate. William Rothstein, believed to have built the device, died of cancer in 2004 before charges could be filed. In 2007, Kenneth Barnes pled guilty and was sentenced to decades in prison. In 2010, Deal Armstrong was convicted of armed bank robbery, conspiracy, and using a destructive device in a crime of violence. She was sentenced to life in prison and died in 2017 while incarcerated. Floyd Stockton was considered a minor conspirator and was granted immunity in exchange for testimony. The FBI eventually closed the case, but one fact remained. Brian Wells was both conspirator and victim, a pawn in one of the strangest crimes in modern history, a bank heist that began with a collar bomb and ended with a mystery that still divides opinion today. The Forrest Fenn treasure. A millionaire art dealer hides a chest filled with treasure somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. To find it, he leaves behind nothing but a cryptic 24-line poem. Over the next decade, tens of thousands search. At least 5 die trying. This is the story of Forrest Fenn's treasure. In 1988, Forrest Fenn, a Santa Fe art dealer and former fighter pilot, had been diagnosed with kidney cancer and was given a poor prognosis. Facing his mortality, he originally planned to end his life in the wilderness beside a chest filled with his favorite artifacts, letting people discover both his body and the treasure. But here's the twist. He survived the cancer, and instead of abandoning the idea completely, he turned it into something bigger. So in 2010, Fenn announced to the world that he had hidden a treasure chest worth millions. In his memoir, The Thrill of the Chase, he published a 24-line cryptic poem containing 9 clues that, if solved correctly, would lead to the treasure. The chest itself was said to weigh about 42 pounds. Inside, gold nuggets, ancient coins, jewelry, and rare artifacts. Estimates placed its value between $1 million and $5 million. And just like that, the hunt was on. The promise of riches captured the world's imagination. Tens of thousands joined the hunt, but the poem was cryptic. Lines like, "Where warm waters halt," and "The end is ever drawing nigh," drove endless speculation. Searchers spread out across 4 states, New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana. And then, the search turned deadly. First victim. In January 2016, 54-year-old Randy Bilyeu vanished while searching for the treasure. 6 months later, in July 2016, his body was discovered alongside the Rio Grande in New Mexico. Second victim. On June 9, 2017, 53-year-old Jeff Murphy was found dead in Yellowstone National Park. He appeared to have slipped and fallen some 500 feet down a steep slope. According to his wife, he was out there searching for Fenn's chest. Third victim. After telling family on June 14, 2017, that he was looking for buried treasure, Pastor Paris Wallace went missing. His car was located near the Taos Junction Bridge, and his body was later discovered downstream along the Rio Grande in New Mexico. Fourth victim. According to friends and family, 31-year-old Eric Ashby told them that he had moved to Colorado in 2016 to search for Fenn's treasure. He was last seen on June 28, 2017, rafting on Colorado's Arkansas River. His raft overturned, he went missing, and his body was found downstream a month later. Fifth victim. In search of Fenn's treasure, 53-year-old Michael Wayne Sexton and 65-year-old friend Stephen Inlow ventured out on snowmobiles mid-March 2020 around Dinosaur National Monument on the Utah-Colorado border. Inadequately dressed for the weather conditions, Sexton died from hypothermia. His companion, Inlow, was rescued and barely survived. So at least 5 lives were lost to the hunt. And still, the chest remained hidden. Fenn occasionally offered hints. He insisted the treasure was not in a dangerous place, not associated with any structure, not in a mine, not in a graveyard, not in a tunnel, and not under a man-made object. It was located at an elevation between 5,000 and 10,200 feet above sea level. He also stated that it was not in a place where a 70 or 80-year-old man couldn't carry a 42-pound box. Helpful, but still vague enough to drive hunters mad. For a decade, no one succeeded. And then, on June 6, 2020, Forrest Fenn made the announcement. The treasure had finally been found. He released photographs of himself examining the chest, confirming its authenticity. But the finder remained anonymous, fueling suspicion that the entire hunt had been a hoax. And then came the reveal. In December 2020, court documents exposed the man's identity. Jack Stoof, a 32-year-old medical student from Michigan. Stoof explained he had solved the poem, locating the chest in Wyoming. He even provided photographs of the site, but kept the exact location secret to preserve the landscape. The chest was examined and appraised. After Forrest Fenn passed away from natural causes at the age of 90 in September 2020, ownership of the treasure transferred to Stoof. In 2022, some of the contents were auctioned. The hunt was over. The treasure was real, but debate still lingers. Were the clues ever truly solvable? Did Fenn design the hunt for adventure, for legacy, or simply for fame? What's certain is this. For 10 years, a riddle written by one man sent thousands chasing fortune across the Rocky Mountains. And for some, that chase cost them their lives. This mystery may be over, but the next one will keep you up at night. Subscribe to find out. The Golden State Killer. California in the 1970s was a place where people lived in fear. A predator stalked the suburbs, breaking into homes, tying up couples, and eventually killing. At first, he was known as the Visalia Ransacker. Later, in Southern California, he became the original Night Stalker. But decades later, both names would be tied to one man, the Golden State Killer. That man was Joseph James DeAngelo. To his neighbors, he appeared to be an ordinary family man. In reality, he was a former police officer living a double life. Between 1974 and 1979, he carried out a wave of crimes, first burglaries, then attacks, then killings. He had a signature method, binding the man, stacking dishes on his back, and threatening to kill both victims if he heard the plates fall. Survivors later recalled him breaking down in tears mid-assault, crying, "I hate you, Bonnie," a reference to his ex-fiancée. At the time, investigators had almost nothing to work with. He left no fingerprints and also avoided leaving other clues. For years, the Visalia Ransacker in Northern California and the original Night Stalker in the South seemed like separate criminals. It wasn't until DNA testing in the 1990s that detectives confirmed they were the same person. True crime writer Michelle McNamara gave him the name that stuck, the Golden State Killer. Even with DNA, his identity remained a mystery. That changed in 2018, when investigators tried a new technique, forensic genealogy. They uploaded his genetic profile to GED Match, a public database used by individuals researching their family history. The results didn't name him directly, but they revealed distant cousins. Building thousands of connections across sprawling family trees, detectives narrowed the search to two men. One of them was Joseph DeAngelo. DeAngelo was 72, living quietly in Citrus Heights, a suburb of Sacramento. Detectives collected his DNA from discarded trash. It was a perfect match. After more than 40 years, the Golden State Killer had finally been caught. DeAngelo was a former police officer who had lived in the same areas where the crimes occurred. He had been engaged to a woman named Bonnie Jean Caldwell in the early 1970s, the same name he had sometimes uttered during his attacks. That detail suddenly made sense. In June 2020, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 killings and 13 kidnappings. He also admitted to more than 50 attacks, though those could no longer be prosecuted. As part of a plea deal, he avoided the death penalty but received life in prison without parole. He was incarcerated in California State Prison in Corcoran. For victims and their families, it was the long-awaited moment of justice. The man who had terrorized California for decades would never be free again. The Unabomber. Imagine a terrorist so elusive that the FBI chased him for 17 years with a 150-agent task force and still came up empty. His bombs were handmade, left no fingerprints, and followed no clear pattern. For years, the Unabomber seemed impossible to identify, until one unexpected clue broke the case wide open, a few familiar words that only his brother recognized. Ted Kaczynski grew up quiet and withdrawn. His brother remembered him hiding in the attic when visitors came. Their mother believed his fear of abandonment came from being hospitalized as a baby. By the age of 16, he was a math prodigy at Harvard. There, he took part in secret psychological experiments led by Professor Henry Murray, a former CIA researcher. Students were asked to share their personal beliefs, but were then mocked and interrogated, with recordings of their words being played back at them. Kaczynski's codename in the study was Lawful. It was the same year, he later said, that he turned against modern technology. But here's where things take a darker turn. After Harvard, he earned a PhD and briefly taught at the University of California, Berkeley, before leaving academia. He built a small cabin in Montana with no electricity or plumbing, choosing near total solitude. From there, he began writing the ideas that would become the infamous Unabomber manifesto. His relationships frayed. He accused his parents of never loving him, was fired from his brother's factory job after harassing a co-worker, and grew increasingly hostile toward the modern world. And this is when the bombing started. From 1978 to 1979, the first two packages injured a student and a guard at Northwestern University. Then, he tried something far more dangerous. A device hidden aboard American Airlines Flight 444. It partially detonated, filling the cabin with smoke, forcing an emergency landing. 12 passengers had to be treated for smoke inhalation. With an aircraft now targeted, the FBI created the Unabomber task force. Even with 150 investigators, they had nothing. Kaczynski's bombs used common scrap parts and left no usable fingerprints. His victims seemed random. The bomber could be anywhere. And then, the violence escalated even more. In 1985, he killed his first victim. Computer store owner Hugh Scruton in Sacramento was killed by a package delivered outside his business. 2 years later, another victim named Gary Wright was left badly injured, and a witness gave police the now famous sketch of a hooded man in sunglasses. For a moment, it seemed like the break they needed, but no one recognized him. And the trail went cold. After 6 years of silence, Kaczynski struck again. Professors at Yale and the University of California, advertising executive Thomas Mosser, and forestry official Gilbert Murray were all targeted and killed. Death tolls rose. Fear spread. In 1995, an unusual event occurred. A 35,000-word manifesto titled Industrial Society and Its Future was sent to local newspapers. It claimed that technology enslaved humanity and justified violence as a form of resistance. The FBI debated, but decided to publish it in major newspapers, hoping someone would see what they couldn't. And someone did. David Kaczynski's wife, Linda Patrick, recognized the writing style of her brother-in-law. It was almost identical to Ted Kaczynski's letters. David didn't want to believe it, but he turned the writings over to the FBI. Linguistic experts compared the samples. The match was undeniable. After 17 years, the manhunt was finally closing in. On April 3, 1996, agents raided Kaczynski's cabin in Montana. Inside, they found bomb components, a live device ready to be mailed, 40,000 pages of journals, and drafts of the manifesto. Everything matched the earlier bombs. Kaczynski was indicted for 3 killings and 10 bombings. He rejected an insanity defense, pleaded guilty in January 1998 to avoid the death penalty, and received life without parole. He spent years at ADX Florence, America's most secure supermax prison, before being moved to a medical facility as his health declined. In 2023, in custody, he took his own life. For his brother David, the choice to turn him in never stopped hurting. Ted never forgave him. But their mother insisted David had done what was necessary. David later became an outspoken activist against the death penalty, haunted by what his brother had become. Over 17 years, the Unabomber killed 3 people and injured 23. The FBI's most expensive manhunt ended not with forensic evidence, but with a family member recognizing the words of a killer. The BTK Killer. For nearly 20 years, Wichita, Kansas lived in fear. A faceless predator stalked its neighborhoods. He crept into homes, bound families, and turned ordinary nights into nightmares. But what made him truly terrifying wasn't just the killings. It was how he toyed with the entire city, writing letters to newspapers and police, mocking them with poems and crude drawings, and signing them with 3 chilling letters: BTK, bind, kill. Between 1974 and 1991, he murdered 10 people. Then, suddenly, he vanished. For 13 years, nothing. No crimes, no letters. Many thought BTK was dead, locked up, or simply gone, but the silence wouldn't last. In 2004, a single newspaper article suggesting the BTK case had gone cold was enough to bring him back. BTK responded with a letter to the police confessing to an old case and including the victim's driver's license as proof. More messages followed, some hidden inside cereal boxes. Inside were letters, puzzles, and drawings describing his crimes. Each was delivered with the same cold confidence. He believed himself to be more intelligent than everyone else, but this time, police were ready, and BTK would make one mistake too many. In one note, he asked detectives if he could send a floppy disk to the police without it being traced. And he demanded they answer honestly. Investigators responded with a fake newspaper ad, assuring him it would be safe. BTK took the bait. The floppy disk arrived with only a single test file, but hidden in the metadata was a name, Dennis. It also showed that the disk had last been used at Christ Lutheran Church. The church president's name? Dennis Lynn Rader. BTK had just exposed himself with a single click. Police put him under surveillance. They spotted him driving a black Jeep Grand Cherokee, the same type of vehicle seen near one of the drop sites. To be sure, investigators obtained a DNA sample from a used tissue that Rader had thrown in a Dillon's grocery store trash can. The test confirmed a conclusive match to DNA recovered from the 1974 killing of 14-year-old Josephine Otero. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested. At first, he denied everything, but soon he began to talk, and he wouldn't stop. Over 30 hours of chilling confessions followed, where he described each crime in detail. He admitted to binding and killing his victims to satisfy violent fantasies. But even as he confessed, Rader still couldn't believe how he'd been caught. When police told him the floppy disk betrayed him, he was visibly shocked. "Why did you lie to me?" he asked. The reply was simple: "Because we were trying to catch you." With overwhelming evidence, Dennis Rader was convicted of 10 killings. He is now serving 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He was sent to the El Dorado Correctional Facility in El Dorado, Kansas, a maximum security state prison. BTK, the killer who thought he could outsmart everyone, will spend the rest of his life behind bars. The Dardeen family murders. When investigators walked into the Dardeen family's trailer, they entered a nightmare. A mother and child were slaughtered, a baby was born during the attack, and the baby was killed instantly. Hours later, the father's body turned up far from home, shot and mutilated. The crime was so grotesque that even hardened detectives believed evil itself had passed through Ina, Illinois that night. A 29-year-old man named Russell Dardeen, his 30-year-old wife Ruby, and their 3-year-old son Peter, lived a modest life in a small trailer in Jefferson County. Ruby was heavily pregnant with the couple's second child. On November 18, 1987, their lives were erased in a matter of hours. Neighbors had alerted police when Russell didn't show up for work. After they arrived, the horror began inside the trailer. Ruby and Peter were beaten to death with a child-sized baseball bat, a gift to young Peter. During the attack, Ruby went into labor. The newborn baby girl was delivered alive but killed moments later. 3 lives ended in that small space, and then came the father's fate. Russell's body was found miles away in a field near railroad tracks. He had been shot 3 times, and his genitals were mutilated. His red Plymouth was discovered near a police station with blood inside. It was as if the crime had been staged in 2 acts, one inside the family home and one outside in the fields. The autopsy and investigative consensus indicate that Russell was killed after his wife and children. The brutality raised more questions than it answered. There was no forced entry at the trailer. Nothing of value was stolen. Investigators concluded the family must have either known or trusted the killer. Robbery, jealousy, and even drug rumors were considered, but all collapsed under a lack of evidence. And then came the leads. Police examined co-workers and acquaintances, including a man who had previously argued with Russell. He was questioned, then cleared. They studied Russell's finances and personal life, but found nothing to explain such violence. Time of death estimates showed Russell had likely been killed first, separated from the others by as much as a day, and then came the confession that further complicated the case. Years later, convicted serial killer Tommy Lynn Sells claimed responsibility. He described the murders in disturbing detail. Some of what he said aligned with known facts, such as the brutality inside the trailer. But much of his story didn't fit. He placed himself in the wrong sequence of events, contradicting evidence. Investigators couldn't prove he was lying, but they couldn't prove he was telling the truth either. Tommy Lynn Sells was executed by lethal injection on April 3, 2014, at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville, which leaves the final truth still out of reach. The Dardeen family murders remain officially unsolved. A baseball bat, a red car, bodies left in separate places, a confession that doesn't fit, and no answers. Nearly 4 decades later, investigators still describe it as one of the bleakest mysteries in American history, as every lead ends in silence. The Setagaya family murders. On the night of December 30th, 2000, a killer broke into a quiet Tokyo home. By morning, 4 people were dead: a mother, a father, and their 2 young children. But what came after the murders is what still chills investigators today. Instead of fleeing, the killer stayed. He ate their food. He used their computer. He changed into fresh clothes from his bag and left the dirty ones behind. He even napped in their living room before vanishing without a trace. The victims were the Miyazawa family: 44-year-old Mikio, his 41-year-old wife Yasuko, and their children Nina, 8 years old, and Rei, 6 years old. They lived in a suburban house in Setagaya Ward, a large residential district in Tokyo, Japan. Their house shared a wall with a public park. That connection to the outside world may have been what drew the killer in. Investigators believe he climbed in through a second-floor bathroom window, striking suddenly and without mercy. The killings themselves were as brutal as the behavior that followed. Mikio, likely after confronting the intruder downstairs, was stabbed repeatedly with a sashimi knife, which snapped inside his head during the attack. Yasuko and Naina were trapped upstairs and attacked with a santoku blade that the killer was forced to take from the kitchen to finish the murders. The last victim was Rei, who was strangled in his bedroom as he slept. And yet, after destroying an entire family, the killer didn't leave. Inside the house, he moved as if he belonged there. He raided the refrigerator, eating ice cream, melon, and drinking barley tea. He sat at the family's computer, browsing websites and attempting to open files. He used their first aid kit to treat his own wounds. Blood from those injuries stained the walls and floors. He even left waste unflushed in the bathroom. Investigators estimate he stayed several hours, possibly until morning, before walking calmly out of the house. And what he left behind was staggering. Fingerprints covered walls, doors, and objects throughout the home. His DNA was in blood traces across multiple rooms. Shoe prints matched those of Slazenger sneakers, sold exclusively in South Korea, with only 4,800 pairs manufactured. He abandoned his clothing. They were a mix of items traced to brands sold in Japan, South Korea, and the US. Soil on his clothes matched a type found near an American military base. Every detail should have led to him, but no database has ever matched his DNA. His fingerprints remain unidentified. More than 1,000 fingerprints were collected, but none matched the databases. The shoes, the clothes, the soil, all ended in dead ends. The evidence feels almost deliberate, like a breadcrumb trail designed to confuse. Who was he? A drifter, or someone staging a performance? Some investigators believe he was a transient, maybe someone living rough in the park who slipped in by chance. Others insist it was the opposite, a calculated intruder who staged chaos and left obvious clues on purpose, daring investigators to solve the puzzle. DNA suggested a man of East Asian ancestry, possibly with a maternal lineage linked to Southern Europe. However, even global searches yielded no results. And then comes the question no one can answer. Why this family? The Miyazawas had no enemies, no ties to organized crime, no secrets. They lived in a house bordering a public park, accessible to strangers, and that may have been their only vulnerability. But why the killer stayed, why he lingered, and why he acted as he belonged in their home remains a mystery. More than 2 decades later, the case is still unsolved. Thousands of interviews have been conducted. The fingerprints and DNA remain unmatched. Despite one of the most extensive investigations in Japanese history, the killer walked out of the Miyazawa home that night and disappeared, leaving behind a family destroyed, a house full of evidence, and a mystery that still feels like it was designed never to be solved. The Keddie Cabin 28 Murders. Cabin 28 in the tiny town of Keddie, Plumas County, Northern California, became the scene of one of America's most haunting unsolved massacres. A mother, her son, and his friend were butchered. A daughter was abducted, and evidence pointing to suspects who were never charged. From the beginning, the crime scene suggested something personal, something organized. The bodies were bound with medical tape and electrical cords. Multiple weapons had been used, and the attacks happened in a single cramped room. And yet, the daughter, 12-year-old Tina, was taken into the night, her remains only surfacing years later. The crime scene spoke of horror and calculation. On the night of April 11, 1981, 36-year-old mother Glenna Sue Sharp, her 15-year-old son John, and his 17-year-old friend Dana Wingate suffered a frenzy of violence. Glenna Sue was gagged with a bandana and her own underwear, stabbed in the chest, and her throat was cut. John was also stabbed and his throat slashed. Dana had head trauma consistent with blunt force and evidence of manual strangulation. At least 2 knives, a hammer, and even the butt of a Daisy 880 BB gun were used. The murders took place in the living room while 3 boys slept unharmed in a nearby bedroom. Then came the missing child. Tina's absence deepened the nightmare. She had been in the cabin during the attack but was abducted from the scene. For 3 years, her fate was unknown, until a skull and fragments of bone were discovered in the woods 50 miles away. Investigators believe she may have been abducted as part of the attack, either to silence her as a witness or because she was the focus all along. The leads have haunted this case for decades. In 2016, a hammer was recovered from a pond near Keddie. It matched the description of one that a local neighbor, Marty Smart, had reported missing. In 2018, DNA recovered from the medical tape binding the victims was linked to a known living suspect, though authorities have never named them publicly. Witnesses reported a green van near Cabin 28 that night. Composites were drawn from the testimony of young Justin, one of the surviving children, although his accounts changed over time. Then came the suspects and the confessions. Marty Smart himself allegedly confessed to a counselor that he killed Sue and Tina, though not the boys. A letter he wrote to his wife seemed to hint at guilt. "I've paid the price of your love, and now I've bought it with 4 people's lives." Yet he was never arrested. Some investigators believe that 2 or more people may have been involved in the crime or its cover-up, and yet the case still refuses to close. The original crime scene was compromised. Neighbors walked through the cabin before it was secured. Evidence was contaminated, and some items were lost forever. Even with DNA, recovered weapons, and confessions, no charges have ever been brought. For the Sharp family, justice has remained elusive for more than 40 years. A mother, son, and friend were slaughtered in one room. A daughter was abducted and left in the woods. Suspects identified, leads uncovered, but no resolution has been reached. Cabin 28 was demolished in 2004, but the mystery lingers, an intimate, organized slaughter that still defies answers. The Zodiac Killer. Between the late 1960s and early 1970s, Northern California lived in fear of an anonymous predator. He didn't just kill, he taunted. Letters, phone calls, and strange symbols began arriving at newspapers, each one signed with a crosshair and a single chilling name: Zodiac. From the beginning, no one could tell how many people had really died at his hands. Officially, investigators linked him to 5 murders and 2 survivors. But in his own words, the number was far higher. It all began quietly on a back road outside Vallejo. On December 20th, 1968, high school students David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen parked along Lake Herman Road. Moments later, both were shot dead. 7 months later, the killer struck again. On July 4th, 1969, 22-year-old Darlene Farron and 17-year-old Michael Mageau were ambushed in a parked car at Blue Rock Springs. Mageau survived, and through his pain, he gave police the first real description of the attacker. Only weeks later, on July 31st, 3 major newspapers, the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner, each received nearly identical letters. They were written by someone claiming responsibility for the shootings. The letters were filled with chilling boasts, threats, and a coded cipher that promised to reveal the killer's identity. This was not just murder. It was theater, staged for the entire public to witness. The attacks continued. On September 27, 1969, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were picnicking at Lake Berryessa when a man in an executioner-style hood confronted them, his chest marked with the now infamous crosshair symbol. Both were bound and stabbed repeatedly. Cecilia Shepard died 2 days later. Hartnell survived and described the costume, an image that would define the Zodiac case for decades to come. Just 2 weeks later, another killing shook San Francisco. On October 11th, cab driver Paul Stein was shot in Presidio Heights. This time, the attack was different. No lover's lane, no secluded area. This was a bold execution in the middle of a city. Police arrived within minutes, but a mistake in the suspect description, broadcast as a black male instead of a white male, allowed the killer to walk away. Witnesses described him as stocky, white, and in his late 30s to early 40s. With every crime, the Zodiac changed his methods, making it nearly impossible to predict what he would do next. The letters didn't stop. The Zodiac mocked investigators, threatened to shoot children as they stepped off a school bus, and claimed to have killed as many as 37 people. His ciphers became the obsession of amateur code breakers and professional cryptographers. The first, known as the 408-character cipher, was solved in just 20 hours by Donald and Betty Harden, 2 school teachers from Salinas. But the solution revealed no name, only a message stating that killing was fun. Another cipher, the 340-character code, remained unsolved for more than 50 years. It wasn't until 2020 that 3 amateur codebreakers, David Orenchak, Sam Blake, and Jarl Van Eyck, finally cracked it. And once again, there was no identity, just further confirmation that the killer himself had written the messages. Even the codes that promised answers only deepened the mystery. Dozens of suspects have been investigated. The most infamous was Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted child predator whose behavior and background made him a prime suspect, but handwriting, fingerprints, and DNA never conclusively tied him to the crimes. Other names surfaced over the years: teachers, journalists, even former police officers, but none could be proven to be the Zodiac. The stakes for the city were enormous. This was one of the first killers to weaponize the media. By publishing his threats, newspapers gave him the stage he craved, while police scrambled to respond. Parents pulled children out of school. People avoided traveling at night. Fear hung over the Bay Area. The Zodiac didn't just kill. He controlled an entire region through terror. To this day, the Zodiac case remains officially unsolved. Police still hold degraded DNA evidence. Experts believe forensic genealogy may provide new opportunities. Every few years, rumors of a breakthrough emerge, but the killer's true identity remains a mystery. And so, the ciphers, the crosshairs, and the letters signed Zodiac continue to cast their shadow across American true crime. JonBenét Ramsey. 1996. Christmas in Boulder, Colorado. A wealthy family, a home filled with holiday decorations, and the promise of a joyful season. But by the next morning, everything had changed. What should have been a perfect holiday turned into one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. On the morning after Christmas, Mother Patsy Ramsey walked downstairs and discovered a letter sitting on the back staircase. Not a quick scribble, but a full 2.5-page handwritten letter. It demanded that the Ramseys pay $118,000 for the safe return of their daughter, JonBenét Ramsey, a 6-year-old child beauty queen. It was a strangely specific amount that later came out to nearly match the annual Christmas bonus of John Ramsey, JonBenét's father. No clear signs of intrusion were found in the house. The letter instructed the family not to contact the police, or their daughter would meet with a gruesome fate. But at 5:52 a.m., Patsy dialed 911 anyway. Officers arrived within minutes, yet they treated the case as a kidnapping, not a murder. Instead of sealing the home, the officers allowed friends, neighbors, and even the family's pastor inside for support. People gathered in the kitchen, moved around the house, and in some cases even cleaned. Evidence that might have solved the crime was destroyed before it could ever be collected. Police waited for the kidnapper's call. The ransom note had set a 10 a.m. deadline, but no call ever came. The hours dragged on, and tension in the house grew. By early afternoon, detectives asked John Ramsey and a family friend to search the house for anything unusual. Oddly, neither John nor Patsy had immediately gone to check JonBenét's bedroom to confirm whether she was actually gone. At around 1 p.m., as part of the search, John went to the basement. In a small, windowless room, he made the discovery that changed everything: JonBenét's body. She was wrapped in a white blanket. She had suffered a blow to the head and had been strangled with a garrote. Instead of leaving her where she was for investigators, John carried her upstairs, further contaminating and compromising the crime scene. Every theory that followed from that point on was therefore built on shaky ground. From the very beginning, nothing about this case seemed to make sense. The ransom letter quickly became the first significant point of division. Why was it so long? Why was it written using paper from inside the house? Handwriting experts cleared John Ramsey, but many said Patsy could not be excluded. Some investigators saw this as proof of a staged crime scene. Others weren't convinced. Suspicion initially focused on the Ramseys. Inconsistencies in their statements, combined with the peculiar ransom note, fueled the belief that the murder had occurred within the family. But another camp championed the intruder theory. They pointed to a broken basement window, a suitcase found beneath it that could have been used to climb inside, and even the possibility that JonBenét had been subdued with a stun gun. Two competing narratives emerged: an inside job or a mystery intruder. Neither could be fully proven. In 1999, a grand jury reviewed the evidence. They voted to indict John and Patsy Ramsey for child abuse, resulting in death, and as accessories to a crime. However, District Attorney Alex Hunter declined to sign the indictment, citing that the case was too weak to bring to trial. That decision left the investigation in limbo. Forensic testing seemed to promise breakthroughs, but only deepened the divide. In the mid-2000s, new DNA analysis detected touch DNA on JonBenét's clothing, that revealed an unknown male profile, which did not match any family member. In 2008, the Boulder District Attorney used this to clear the Ramseys in a public letter. This was a DA's decision, not a court ruling. Many experts criticized the decision, arguing that the sample was too small and could have been contaminated. Even modern DNA technology created more questions than answers. The media firestorm turned the case into a cultural obsession. For years, the Ramseys were treated as guilty in the court of public opinion. Documentaries and TV specials dissected every angle, with theories shifting back and forth. In 2016, a CBS special suggested that Burke Ramsey, JonBenét's older brother, might have been involved. Burke responded with 2 lawsuits for defamation, one against CBS and another against Werner Spitz, a well-known forensic pathologist. Both lawsuits were later settled confidentially. Despite decades of investigation, no one has ever been charged with the crime. The Ramseys have repeatedly requested additional DNA testing, most recently in 2022, when they petitioned for evidence to be re-examined using advanced methods. Nearly 3 decades later, the murder of JonBenét Ramsey remains one of America's most haunting mysteries, where every clue seems to contradict the next. The Tylenol Murders. In the fall of 1982, Chicago was shaken by a wave of sudden, unexplained deaths. Ordinary people, young and healthy, collapsed without warning. Doctors couldn't explain it. Families were blindsided. One after another, lives were cut short, and at first, no one knew why. The cases seemed scattered. The victims included 12-year-old Mary Kellerman, who died early in the morning after complaining of a cold. Hours later, 27-year-old Adam Janus collapsed in his home. Later that same day, his brother Stanley and sister-in-law Teresa also died suddenly, leaving investigators scrambling for answers. Then more victims appeared across the suburbs. Mary McFarland, 31, Paula Prince, 35, and Mary Reiner, 27. Perfectly healthy, gone in an instant. What could possibly connect such different people, in different places, all dying the same sudden way? It took investigators days to uncover the link. Each of the victims, just before their deaths, had taken something almost every household in America kept on hand: extra-strength Tylenol. The discovery was chilling. These weren't factory mistakes. Someone had deliberately taken bottles off store shelves, opened the capsules, replaced the medicine with potassium cyanide, and put them back for unsuspecting customers to buy. Each capsule contained a massive dose, enough to kill a healthy adult. A trusted pain reliever had been turned into a murder weapon. Panic spread quickly. Stores rushed to pull Tylenol products from shelves. Hospitals and police set up hotlines for terrified callers. Johnson & Johnson, the company behind Tylenol, ordered an unprecedented recall of 31 million bottles nationwide. The investigation became one of the largest in Illinois history. Police, federal agents, and medical examiners all collaborated, but the evidence was scarce. There were no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no surveillance cameras. Whoever committed the murders had vanished without a trace. One man, James Lewis, came under suspicion after he sent a letter to Johnson & Johnson demanding $1 million to stop the killings. He had a history of fraud and violence, but the evidence only tied him to extortion, not murder. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but served only 12, and was never charged with the poisonings themselves. The killer was invisible. However, the impact was evident everywhere. Johnson & Johnson's response reshaped the industry. The company redesigned its packaging to include tamper-evident seals, triple-layer protection, and later, a switch to solid caplets instead of capsules. These became the standard for over-the-counter medicine worldwide. Despite renewed investigations over the decades, including advanced DNA testing on evidence and re-examinations of suspects, the Tylenol murders remain unsolved. In 2009, the FBI searched James Lewis's home in Cambridge, Massachusetts again, but no new charges were ever filed. He died in 2023 at the age of 76, still considered a prime suspect by many, although he was never proven guilty of the crime. More than 40 years later, the Tylenol murders remain one of America's most unsettling cold cases, where 7 random deaths changed how the world buys medicine forever. This mystery may be over, but the next one will keep you up at night. Watch now.